Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. I'm here yet again presenting you a view of the Ukraine war. It's an interesting war in our times because a lot about this war is not known. What is being circulated around is what is being told to us by the Western and the contemporary media. There is a lot behind this war that people don't know about. The true histories, the true facts, and how this war actually originated not recently, but years and years and years ago, right after the break of the Soviet Union, actually. I have with me Lieutenant General Ashok Shivane, who's going to take us through the Ukraine conflict, his observations about the conflict, and what's going to happen around the world because of this, especially the China factor. Thank you so much, sir, for joining me for this conversation. I know a lot has been written, spoken about it, but I'm looking forward for your views.
Thank you very much, Aadi. It's a pleasure to be on your platform and share my views on an ongoing conflict that has engulfed the entire globe in some way or the other.
The effects are starting to be felt, especially when you go to the gas station, sir. So,
yeah.
The thought of actually, getting you on the show came up when I read your article, and that's something that was very interesting because you took through a whole story sort of a thing for the premise for this conflict and what is happening with China and so on and so forth. So I'd like to kind of ask you, you didn't directly, but I got a hint that you wanted to compare the Russians with the Germans post the Treaty of Versailles and how a nation would react when it's being pushed into a corner. How do you kind of, I'd like you to kind of give us your reasoning for that, sir.
Sure. Yes, I did write on that aspect. But before I answer your questions, I would like to highlight three critical aspects of war and warfare in the 21st century, which come to my mind. First, let me at the outset say that war is certainly destructive, horrendous, and it has rarely brought peace, but surely attendant misery. And no one knows better than a soldier. So a soldier always hopes for peace. That is one. Yet, war doesn't happen with a bat of a eyelid. It's not a switch on or switch off tap syndrome. It results in a series of actions with an escalatory matrix. And it is during this process that the levers of conflict prevention must be put in, which in the instant case were ignored or diluted in its content for whatever reasons of personal interest that the nations must have. And these levers are political, diplomatic, military. They have an entire sphere of it. So what is happening is that the complexity of 21st century warfare is that there are more proxies and hidden agendas than those in physical contact. And they fire the gun from the other's shoulder. So both war prevention and conflict resolution have become increasingly more complex. My second point that comes to mind is, look, predicting the war and its outcome is easy. But the only thing is difficult is getting it right. There's so many who've spoken of it. We knew that Russia was being driven to the back, a war was coming. But how, where, when remained a part of ambiguity or a source of difference of opinion. And in this wars which happened today, the notion of victory is actually a notion of narratives and counter narratives and shaping of perceptions and filters that has come in. Thus, conflict resolution and understanding the conflict has become more complex. Very easy to draw wrong lessons, because you are commenting on something that is filtered for your ear. My third aspect, which I like to highlight before I answer your question, is that every nation that goes to war has a politico-military aim in terms of a desired end state, whether it be military, whether it's been economic, whether it be political. and a conflict termination profile. And nations don't go to war just without that. So the force orchestration and force application is a function of these factors. And therefore, in today's war, targeting the mind is more important than targeting the capabilities itself. And therefore, capitulation is more important than capture. Because once a nation's will is defeated, the nation is defeated. And we've seen this. There's nothing new but the. No, sorry. Now, coming down to your question, based on what my article was, where I drew historical background and related it to the way the Germans were treated post World War One and the Treaty of Versailles. And do we learn something from the history? Yes. Look, the present conflict in Ukraine is embedded in the historical geopolitical fault lines more than the predominant spheres of influence or strategic location of nations or geoeconomics of resource driven expansion. And let me take you back to the 19th century, Monroe Doctrine 1823. Now, Monroe Doctrine 1823 was a defining foreign policy path of the United States, which in a way encouraged a unilateral intervention, aggressive hegemonic behavior for a self-defined rule-based order. And this has been repeatedly, even in the 21st century, been spoken by the establishments in US and quoted as it. Now they forget the lesson. There is nothing known as absolute power. Even superpower has its limits. And therefore, history is a place of reference, but not a place of residence. My second point relating to history is thereafter came the Treaty of Versailles, June 1990, after the First World War. It was probably one of the most controversial Armitage treaty post-World War, which sowed the seeds of repression, hate, and mistrust instead of peace and growth. And therefore, it boomeranged because it had a slave and a master syndrome in it. And it boomeranged, and then you saw it led to the World War II. So, in the present context, sanctions and threats are counterproductive for conflict resolution and enduring peace. So, therefore, there is more to peace than punitive responses in terms of economic responses or such responses which may come up by nations. Now, after the Treaty of Versailles, if you see World War II took place, and post World War II, at the period between the Soviet Union disintegration in 1991, that is the period between 45 to 91, there are nearly, 45 to 2001 at least, there are nearly 248 conflicts that have taken place, big, small. Out of that, 201, which is 81%, as some research done, have been contributed either to initiated or ignited or vetted by the United States for the West. Now, that's a huge figure, and figures speak for themselves. Then there was this Cold War era which came in. In this Cold War era, what you saw was not USSR alone. It was a era of political military alliance of NATO versus the Warsaw, which came in, which had a more aggressive nuclear overtones. Now, in this, what is to be highlighted is the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that has certain equivalents. While it was Kennedy and Khrushchev that time, now read Biden and Putin. For Cuba, read Ukraine. The only difference is that time, the Soviet Union deployed the missiles in Cuba 90 kilometers, 90 miles from US, which posed a threat directed to them. And there was chaos. The world never nearly went into a nuclear war. And now the same threat has been put on the Ukraine soil against Russia, and then the responses are that why did they go to war? After you militarize the area, after you put numerous bio labs, after you put missionaries in those areas, after you've given them political support, and then after you back up, go out of the scene and let Ukraine fight. Is it fair? I leave it to those who are listening. Then came the post-Soviet Union disintegration, 1991, where USSR was split into 15 independent nations. Fine, it was accepted by Russia. It was the largest part of the disintegration country. Second was Ukraine. And both had not only size, importance, but they had resources, military, nuclear, energy, food granary. So they were two important countries, and they were besides each other. So what happened during this period? Between 1991 to 2001, the NATO expanded in 5 tranches to engulf 14 countries of erstwhile Russia and those bordering Russia and in Central Asian Republic as part of their alliance, both with NATO and with the European Union. So what was left was Belarus to the north, Ukraine center, and Crimea was part of Ukraine that time to the lower half. Belarus, of course, had a pro-Russian disposition and were not inclined for the West, and therefore did not pose a threat. Crimea was taken in 2014. The reasons I will not go into, but there were reasons of its annexation oblique it's adopting the Russian model. But what remained was Ukraine, which was of utmost sensitivity as a buffer and a direct threat to Russia. This had been consistently spoken of. And what did the West do to Ukraine? In Budapest Agreement, December 1994, they denuclearized Ukraine and gave them assurances of the security concern that they would continue to the security concern would continue to be taken care of, and that assurance was given. Simultaneously, Russia kept shouting since 2014 of its sensitivity of Ukraine. It kept, even after the referendum in Crimea and its annexation, it kept talking of Ukraine as the deadline. In fact, one of the US ambassadors to Russia, who later became a CIA, said Ukraine is niyat, a big no. But wherein the establishment did they realize? Minsk agreements for the Donetsk and the Luhansk region did not see the light of the day. The European Union and the NATO kept fueling political military presence in an escalatory matrix. Therefore, if you're pushed to the wall, not heard, and all that was being asked was assurances that it will not go the West way, it will not become a NATO, or it will not get militarized, because it is not at the doorstep of Russia, it is at opening the door of Russia. That's the threat to Russia. There was nothing beyond that. And this key today of deconstructing the West's support to Ukraine is followed that wasn't enough. It seems like a well orchestrated bluff. So, to the tall and short of it is that there were sequential events which led to this psychological, military, political escalation of threat to Russia. There was an ostrich approach of not understanding the security concerns of Russia. And then there was propping up of a proxy and then washing your hands up and letting it go down the garden path as such. That's the reality of the geopolitics of the Russia-Ukraine war. So, Adi, these were my thoughts which built up the events pertaining to Russia. And if I may add another 2 minutes for this related issue, which is very important to understand before we go to any other questions, is the strategic overview of the conflict. It's very important to understand the Russian and the West perspective on it. Otherwise, we will not understand the unfolding of the dynamics. So, what was of all this background which I've spoken of, what was Putin's objective? What was his end state? I think it came out loud and clear even in his address, or otherwise, it requires no rocket science. It was to demilitarize and possibly divide Ukraine with a pro Russian dispensation so that it emerges as a buffer state which poses no threat to its core interests of both security and economy. And for for this desired end state, the strategic message to the West translated into military, political, and economic objectives. The military objective, as I see it, was to or is to Ukraine to divide along the river Dnieper that provides a geographical boundary between the east and west, and then destruction of the war waging potential, which is spoken as the demilitarization. I think the political objective was very clear when it talks of denazification for the regime change. He will put a pro-Russian leader. The names are circulating around, but I think that's one of the key objectives. And third was an economic objective, which was cutting off the crescent of land or having a land overbridge along the sea all the way from Donbass to Kharkiv. That means starting from Odessa, which is Ukraine's major port in Black Sea, all the way to Mariupol, Ukraine's only major port in the Sea of Azov, Donbass inching up to Kherson, Dnipro, and all the way to Kharkiv. And what was the West wanting? West wanted, firstly, weakening of the rise and influence of Russia, and indirectly, a collision which may take place with two powerful, countries, Russia and China, emerging as one strong pole, which could act as a threat to US and the West. Second was, I think, aim was to ensure Putin's isolation and fall of image as a dictator, and therefore Putin's Bonhoming was seen as a dangerous outcome. And how did they do it? They want to fuel a bit. The result seems quite clear that the defender, Ukraine, has been left all by itself and is on the back foot. So what would the West and the US want? Fuel and abet insurgency to bleed Russia. make Ukraine Afghanistan, and therefore weaken Putin like they did in Afghanistan post the with the pro-Russian regime, and especially in the western part of it, and that would lead them politically, economically, and military. Second, there's a policy of containment, what they call it containment 2.0, hitting him with unprecedented sanctions to weaken his war machinery, his economic rise. But will sanctions work? Alternatives are always there, and sanctions always tend to boomerang, have a spillover effect on euro, effect on energy, effect on petrodollar. And strategically, I think one of the aims was to militarize Europe to counter Russia in the future, while US focuses on China. Because strategically, they would have been outstretched to focus on both. So you've seen the militarization of Europe not taking place, the Germans pumping in money. You've seen Sweden, Finland, who remained on the neutral seat, now talking and providing, talking of military help, neutrality. Therefore, they de facto they have militarized Europe. And lastly, which is not yet spoken too much, is to keep its military industrial complex going post Afghanistan. There was a very interesting analysis I was reading this morning that the major defense industry in US and in Europe from 1st December 2021, oh sorry, 1st November 2021 to 1st March 2022 have got their shares rise anything from 21 to 36%. So there is also an angle of that, not only in this, because there is a large number of people employed in this which will go out of employment. So you can't keep this factor away. The RA, none of this, is helping humanity or bringing peace. It's created huge, global dynamics and flux. And who's suffering? Ukraine, people, soldiers, for a cause which is in the minds of those who never seen the battlefield.
The funny thing is, for USA's own purpose, I think I agree with you, because this is an analysis that people need to do to understand the real causes of the war. I mean, the tensions between Ukraine and Russia, have been there for decades now, and it's not overboiled into a hot war. There have been, clashes and this and that and stuff like that, but it didn't really overflow into a hot war, pushing Ukraine into a NATO status and then re-energizing their mental capability, if I may put it that way. If it may not be, because one looks at the Ukrainian resistance in 2014 during the Crimean annexation, it was horrible. So in about 6-8 years, they've been trained up. They've been, brought to a part where they could fight and create a problem for Russia. And I absolutely agree with you. And this is a larger picture of things that has been actually omitted from the narrative of this war. So, getting down to the military aspect of it, a lot of criticism, I mean, apart from the humanitarian crisis criticism, but the criticism of the way the Russians have actually gone on for this military offensive, in terms of spreading into three prongs and this and that. You kind of hinted it in the middle that their objective would be to cut off Ukraine into half at the Dnieper, which is something that was in talks before as well. How do you think they are doing currently with regards to that particular aim? And the analysis of the world, which says they are slow, they are fast, they're not using much, they're using too much, or whatever it is. There's just too much in the public domain. What's your opinion, sir?
I think we are probably deciphering lessons a little too fast, you know, but especially at the operational and tactical level. Yes, at the high level, lessons have certainly emerged, and therefore, when I would say that, look, the way they have orchestrated the force levels, uh, they shape the battle space both by kinetic and non-kinetic means, right? They recognized Donan's advance, gave them treaty, told them their independence, had a security arranged with them, had psychological warfare built up in which the schools started having the Russian syllabus, there's more orientation there. So they built up a environment. Cyber warfare, psychological warfare were all built up. And this took place over the last 2, 3 months, particularly in a more targeted form. And when they finally launched, what did they do? It's a very professional event. I've interacted with the Russian military and the high military hierarchy as such on matters professional. They do believe that shaping of the battle space in terms of targeting the critical centers of gravity, like airfields, command control centers, war waging machineries like the defense industrial factories, the fuels, where economically they will, the energy sources where they'll be economically hurt. This is all a part of the shaping of the battle space. Then the terrain is a major factor of force application and force orchestration. If you remember, Putin had said special operations. He didn't talk a full-fledged war, and you saw the way the pincers developed in a typical maneuver warfare application, both from the north, south, west, and east, and then encircling these centers of gravity which are there. He is quite clear. People talk of 40 miles of a tank convoy halted outside Kiev. No professional is crazy to put tanks inside a built-up area. If you can capitulate an area, cut it off from all means, like what happened in Dhaka. You surround it and there is a sense of physical and psychological paralysis. Why have you to go down into a hybrid sort of thing where you lose advantage of your forces? After all, these forces are meant to have a physical and psychological paralysis on the enemy. Why didn't he use the greater part of his ballistic missiles, which are not, some of them have not been used, to just pump and destroy these cities? Why did he leave the humanitarian corridors open? Why was light, electricity, water still available in these cities? Why were people are not talking the percentage of civilian casualties that took place as compared to full-scale wars in the previous compared to anything? Why were the civilian casualties relatively low? Because there was a sensitivity. So those special operations which he spoke of was by these operational maneuver groups in the quantum that was required. Possibly where he went wrong, or maybe was in the time-space calculation. Possibly, to my mind, uh, uh, he did not war game it to the extent that it would take a much longer time than that was desired. And when you take a longer time, it has attendant problem not only militarily of logistics, of pockets of resistance building up, uh, international pressure building up. There are a whole lot of issues that come up. So I think the planning and and orchestration of forces, I would give it to the Russians. But the execution in terms of understanding the sort of resistance that might be put in was, I think, a little underestimated by them. And that had a time penalty attached to it. Nevertheless, nevertheless, I think another factor is, would Russia have done the same thing if Ukraine was nuclearized? The Budapest Treaty was not there and they had nuclear. It's a big question. So nuclear weapons do deter war. That's QAD. Requires no sense to do this thing. So therefore, it's important to understand this, even while clarity is not there, because you and I are reading what is played up to us, narratives counter narratives, and therefore we can only conjecture. But in this conjecture, at the strategic level, what we can certainly say with certainty is that there are no interests but self-interests. Treaties and rules of global order are only things which inevitably get sidelined or diluted for the common interests of that country. Second thing, conventional wars are here to stay. All those pundits, politicians, diplomats, and some military thinkers who've been saying that war is not an option, I'm sorry. You have to be a long distance runner, even if you feel that there is a short distance race. You have conventional wars are here to stay, and more so in our context when you have disputed borders. Yes, they have an emerging perspective, they have a change of character with time. Therefore, boots and cracks on ground will continue to remain. Second, there is no power without hard power. If you don't have a hammer, you will behave like a nail and be hammered. So hard power today commands respect. The next strategic level lesson we must learn is self-reliance and self-sufficiency is the only key for preservation of the national interests. Expect no one in your times of need. That is the sensibility. Next you have to learn is weaponization is not only of military, but in this the financial domain, there's economic domain, there was civil, there is airspace today. And last, another thing that you have to realize that UN has become defunct. All these lectures of morality, human rights, freedom of speech are pure geopolitical tools. There is no rule-based order. Rules are written and rewritten by nations and broken with ease. For a term called core legitimate national interests. Everything under this term gets wiped out. And that is something dangerous that we are facing this world. So these are things which have been played up so far, and we need to understand.
I think all the points that you mentioned are spot on, and that's something that India must learn from this entire battle. That today we have a stronger economy, we've got good relations, so the pressure tactics that are being played with us are much mellow, much softer. They don't want to offend you; they just want to suggest you, which is not the case with weaker countries like Pakistan, where we've seen what's happening in the past couple of days. Sir, coming to Asia, China has been twiddling his thumbs. The new Putin coordinating with Chinese President Xi Jinping about the date of the invasion. There have been talks about the Chinese financing this invasion. Now there are talks about Chinese actually supporting the Russians through the sanctions. That also is making the Chinese nervous because there's been a statement coming out from the White House warning China against the same. How do you look at the Chinese situation? What are they looking for this thing, and how scared are they in taking through the backlash of this conflict?
Uh, Very well, I think for China, this is both a strategic opportunity and a challenge which has emerged. And in a way, it's given an adrenal boost to its professed legitimate core interests. Uh, and when I say opportunities, it got opportunities in the past. The first opportunity was uh, when the Cold War took place. Everyone thought China was a slumber, but that was when it was massaging its back to rise. Then came the global war on terrorism. It's got its second breather. Third breather it got during the pandemic. And now it's got another breather when the focus from uh, Asia and Indo-Pacific in particular has gone to the transatlantic, to the European battlegrounds. So if you look at China and look at the opportunity, I look at it from the opportunity and challenges that. I mean, I think from the lens of this term of core legitimate interests, which is very, very often repeated by China, you could very well read Taiwan for Ukraine in future. Yes, they are two different ball games, but still. And if Taiwan happens, is it going to get the same treatment as Ukraine? Are people going to put their forces inside? I have my doubts. South China Sea. What about closer home in the Himalayas, in our disputed areas, in Arunachal? So, does that give China more aggressive and bold disposition? Does the Russian Chinese bonding, military, economic, and political, pose greater challenges to US, whose status, power, military, economic is descending, whose focus is bifurcating, yet it doesn't want to be displaced as the world number one power. China is also taking the pleasure in the quad fracture, which, in terms of the abatement by India, in the abstainment by India in the UN vote, is the only country in the quad which abstained. So they are all watching this, and it has ramifications psychologically and physically for China. Yet there are challenges. The challenges are: is this conflict weakening the influence of China in Europe, where it was making a fair, a fair amount of ingress into those areas? Because it will be seen that it was siding with Russia now. Will this impact its standing in Europe? Will these sanctions, both economic and in terms of currency, because it's a globalized way, interconnected. Okay? Yes, there are alternatives, whether it is to the credit card, whether the Swift system of banking, there are alternatives. But it will have a transitory impact, which will have an economic impact. And therefore, it is important when we talk of China. China focus is on US to upset to become the world number one power and upset the apple cart of US. And how does it do that? That's where the Sino-Russian relationship needs to be studied. Is it a marriage of convenience or is it an alliance? The truth is neither one of them. It's all opportunist. There are many alignments, misalignments, contradictions in it. Yet there is a common anti-US agenda. There is US strategic balancing in Asia, which concerns China, and there is NATO's expansion in Europe, which concerns Russia. So both have a common adversary, and both benefit by dividing the focus and the resources of US. So force US into a dual containment, which will result in a strategic overreach. And that's where there is a unity of thought in two leaders, Xi and Putin, at their leadership alignment. Both love each other, both have awed each other and the systems. So therefore, this understanding this relationship is very important. It also helps in bridging capability gap. China needs energy. It needs superior technology, which the Russians have. Yeah, both Xi and Putin have a common anti-US agenda, which benefits both, and there is alignment of their leadership thoughts, and Xi, to an extent, owes Putin way of functioning and the Russian system, and that he made it very clear. Besides, I was talking of that they complement and bridge capability deficits of each other. China requires energy, requires superior technology, understanding military systems, which they do from Russia, and Russia wants their economy to grow. And what better place than a market that requires its energy and helps its economy to grow? So therefore, there is a fundamental cohesion, but that cohesion is based on an anti-US stance. And if this anti-US balance by either China or Russia swings, then this relationship gets impacted. There's also conflicted interests of US and China in the Central Asian Republic. That can be overlooked. China often has been indirectly saying that Russian ambitions outpace its capability. And Russia may not forget the betrayal during the Cold War by China. And China fears that there may be betrayal in the new Cold War by Russia. So these are dynamics which have to the shift in balance makes this relationship quite vulnerable also. So what does the US now face? It faces the China military economic challenge which is upscale to the US as never seen before. It sees a more aggressive and remilitarized Russia, challenging the NATO, and therefore by compounding America's strategic outreach and distracting it from China, the new Cold War will open greater space for Chinese belligerence and power status, facilitate that, and that has what your question was, and adverse interplay dynamics closer home in Asia, South Asia, and in particular in China-India relationship.
Playing these games, it's uh, it's quite obvious there is something at play at the back end of this that they are expecting to happen, because um, God only knows what time is going to actually bring about in geopolitics with regards to this, because we see the entire world order kind of taking a flip back, and that's what you also wrote on. The entire world order is going to change. Everything is going to change. So India's position has been pretty interesting, in spite of not having very direct interests in terms of location on so on and so forth, or investment for that matter within Ukraine, for that, if I may say so. Unlike the previous situation that you and I discussed, which was Afghanistan, so there is a little bit of a difference. Generally, looks the same. Uh, but communication with India has surprisingly been very clear by both the sides, and that's probably one of the first times we're seeing India in a global player sort of a thing. We're also one of the few countries that were successfully able to take out our people from Ukraine, in spite of the fact that there are a lot many other countries, for example, China, who's not been able to do it till now. They're starting their efforts today. The West has not been able to do it. So we've basically been able to get through the entire system and figure it out. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's mellow pressure on India with regards Russia. How do you think India has played its game and needs to play its game in the future now?
Adi, there are certain realities in geopolitics which have to be understood with the national interests. And as I said earlier, there's no interest but national interest. Just as India cannot afford to lose Russia, the US cannot afford to lose India. India needs Russia not only for its strategic partnership, its energy needs, its military supplies, a leverage against hegemonic China. There are many factors to political, economic, historic, and military to the relationship that is deep with Russia. Besides a very high level of trust based on the past. US needs India to face off the ultimate challenger to American global dominance, which is China. So they look at India because of its strategic location, centrality, its oceanic geography, and in particular the Indo-Pacific power play and India's role within that to curtail China. But when it came to Himalayas, everyone was mum. There was no pressure built up. No one went to the UN. Why? Because that didn't concern them. The US needs India because it wants someone strong enough, stronger than Australia and Japan, in the Indo-Pacific, and knowing that India already has a strained relationship with China and would be willing to have a strategic partnership, even though undefined as military, but defined as economic. But the contents and the psychological impact of that is well known. So that is the triangular relationship between Russia, India, and US. India's stand, to my mind, is not pro-Russia, not pro-US, it is pro-India. and pro-India for the preservation and for the furtherance of its national interests. There are no interests but self-interests that I've been repeatedly saying in the real politics. And India today is no more a swing power; it's a balancing power. It balances its national interests. It has no alliances. It has arrangements which benefits mutually its national interests and aligns with the others. So today, India stands uh, as a global player, not a global spectator in the global arena. Therefore, it stands at twice at the UN Security Council, once in the UN General Assembly. To my mind, is pragmatic, bold, and balanced. It has also openly saying in the global forum and to Ukraine and Russia for the cessation of hostilities. Please stop war. At the request of Ukraine, it has even promised humanitarian aid. It's used a soft power Operation Ganga of evacuation of Indians under adverse war conditions. So there is a credibility factor also which is built up at the global arena. And here presents here presents a strategic opportunity for India to play a global role of a peacemaker in this conflict. There are only two countries who can do that: China and India. China, there's distrust from the West, and therefore they may not be very inclined because they may think that they've got a hidden agenda in all this. But I think India is placed in a very well balanced place to play a role of West and US and play a role of Russia to understand Ukraine and be the mediator to bring in peace among the warring sides. I think that is a strategic opportunity that India, because of its respect that it commands in the global arena, because of its recent recognition that has come up, must exploit. I think that is very important.
I, I mean, you've actually put it very succinctly, but if I may actually add my humble opinion, the Russians would not trust Chinese as well. Uh, as a matter of fact, because they might just know that yeah, these guys will push us into a hole, so that they can kind of become the top boss in the region. So the chances for India, where both the parties kind of have a trust factor, is quite good. But having said that, there is a disturbing thing which comes out about. I'd like to ask you this, and also your, the disturbing thing is that the Russians have been constantly putting across, and this has come from the highest office in Russia, about kidnapping of Indian students again and again and again and again and again. And that kind of is, to my mind, it's being brushed off, but it will also build up a certain amount of negative feeling within India. So that's my first this thing. And secondly, sir, uh, concerning India again, you've also shared this article and the news about light tanks being developed in India. I'd like you to tell us the role of tanks within this particular battle, because some people are calling it the opportunity of tanks. Some people are actually calling it a great opportunity for the tanks going forward. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think the first part of the question, where one must understand in a war zone, very difficult to to identify nationalities and filter them. And when you have such a large number of Indian students, which are studying there. But what percentage of those students was subjected to targeting antagonism or targeted killing? Even Russia has gone on to say that the killing of one of the Indian students, an inquiry will be held into the circumstances in which it is. There is a whole lot of campaign to build anti-Russian posture by talking of all this kidnapping and all this. But have you heard of any names in that? I haven't heard. The very fact that they have opened humanitarian corridors, which of course have had an effect of refugees in the Europe, but humanitarian corridors through which we could evacuate in Poland or otherwise our own citizens. I think I have not come across the term humanitarian corridors taking place in today's wars and conflict zone. So, we need to understand that all sorts of force and terrain and psychological human terrain frictions will be built in this narrative to bring about anti-Russian viewpoint. I mean, it's not anti-Russian or anti-US. It's a viewpoint that we must have based on facts on ground. So I don't think there's very much to worry on that ground. People have been in touch, both the ministry has been in touch in Ukraine, in Russia. We're the only nation who have sent 3 ministers in the Operation Ganga to go on ground and get our guys back. Which nation has done that? To fly in war zones for our own people. I think that will have a very far-reaching impact, both within the nation and globally. Coming down to your question on whether it's the obituary of the tank or the opportunity of the tank or the, one thing is very clear. When I spoke of wars are here to stay and conventional wars are here to stay, they may have a different character in terms of added spices of third generation warfare, hybrid warfare, IEW warfare. But warfare, as long as there's warfare, there will be boots and tracks on ground. And what is, when you see a tank, what does it do? It becomes an instrument of deterrence and an instrument of decision in war. Why in the de-escalation phase 1 which took place in Ladakh, the first were the tanks to pull back? Because these are the ones with offensive content to able to traverse with impunity and protection into enemy territory and bring about devastation. Now, this obituary of the tank has repeatedly been written by those strategic pundits or who have a parochial mindsets also. When the attack helicopter came in, there's a tank as history. When third generation missiles came in, top attack missiles came in, there's a tank as history. When UCAVs came in, drones came in, they said tank is history. But then this fellow keeps emerging and everyone awes at him. All the media channels, all the pincers that are being shown are all led by the tank and all shown by, all pictures being shown by the tank. Then why is this relevance of this guy? Because tank anti-tank is a dynamic that will continue to be played. Why do you see images of tanks with a top hood? Because the anti-tank missiles, top attack, where it's most vulnerable, once that hits off in a shaped charge, by the time it impacts the tank, it has lost its power. And there are also reports of the US spike missiles which have failed on the T-72B3 tanks. There are narratives being shown from distance of a vehicle burning, which are the BTR-80 of the Ukraine army, and saying these are the Russian tanks convoys that are being targeted and burnt. That apart, the point is, as long as you have disputed borders, you talk of operation maneuver groups, and you talk of integrated battle groups in the Indian context. These are the spearheads of this integrated battle groups, which the Russians call it operational maneuver groups, which will lead because they are lethal, protected firepower with high maneuverability. So professionals must understand, why is there an escalated buildup of mechanized forces on our northern borders? Because we understand the dynamics, the role that they will play from T-72s to T-90s in the northern border. And today, it's very heartening to, a project of light tank, which I was personally very keen on and drove it with a lot of energy, that it has got in principle approval of the government to go ahead with the Indian light tank. Why? Because these Indian light tanks will go to those areas where the medium category tanks cannot reach. And therefore, it is important to understand that a light tank is not only light by weight, it has a high maneuverability in terms of turning radius, it has a high firing angle gun, and yet it has the modern protection systems for it. Therefore, there are a large number of areas in our context, both on the northern borders and the eastern borders, which have plateaus, which have plains, which have tankable countries, where these will continue to act as instruments of deterrence, and should things go worse, a force of decision. So I think we must grow over individual service perspective levels and see warfare as an integrated application of forces, joint services forces, with a combined arms team. And in that combined arms team and joint warfare, the tank is certainly going to stay for the foreseeable future.
I'm just going to add one little thing, and with a very light heart. So you mentioned about the American military-industrial complex. The question is, who's making the Stingers, the man-pads, and the anti-tank Javelin missiles? It's those guys. So obviously, the Russian tanks are bad. There is no two questions about it. And if there were American tanks fighting there, then the M1A1 Abrams would have been the best, and the anti-tank weapons would have been useless. So that's the narrative war that can be explained.
There is another narrative which is brilliant, that the large inventory of Spike and the American, the British, handheld light anti-tank weapon system, NGLAWS, have all outlived their shelf life. So before they are poofed up, it was a good option. That's, I think, in a light-hearted. But then I did read it somewhere that a large number of them were in the last stage of their shelf life.
One would never know, sir. I mean, with the current events, and one of the things that all the speakers that have spoken about Ukraine and the various geopolitical things, whenever I ask a question about India, they've all just mentioned about one simple thing: we need to fight our own battles, and that's what you also said. There is no question about depending on anybody else. We have not done it till date. We don't want to do it from now on. It's our game, it's our interest, it's our country, and we will fight for it. That's just about it. Um, you know, heart goes out for all the civilians who are stuck in this entire geopolitical game. But beyond that, um, you know, this country has basically fallen into a trap that sadly, I think only the West and the Russia, of course, realized. They kept warning them, but they didn't listen. Sir, thank you so much. You brought out quite a bit in terms of the perspectives behind this war, because everybody's talking about, as I just mentioned in my last statement, that your heart goes out for the civilians moving off. I just saw an update saying 2 million refugees have left. You know, these are people like us who are working, trying to earn a living, having their own life. Suddenly they have to leave everything and go. God alone knows when they will come back, where they will go, and so on and so forth. It's a sad situation. Having said that, countries like India, of course, India must be very careful not to fall in these geopolitical traps. Look forward, look at your own interests, as you know, the general also brought about, and make sure that we are able to you know, war game each one of these situations before we take decisions. So, thank you once again. Very well thought of article as well as this talk. It is, you know, I'm sure a lot of the viewers are going to enjoy going through a historical lesson and a background for this entire battle. Till next time, sir, for another subject. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind, and thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.